Hello everyone, Mr. Lipchick here. Today we're going to talk in a little more depth about the Middle Ages, talk about the social classes and the feudal hierarchy in a little more detail. The economic system of the Middle Ages was called Menorialism, referring to the manor or the feudal territory that was governed by the nobleman or monarch who was in charge. The manor was a self-sufficient economic system. With all the disorder in Europe and fear of the unknown, lack of communication, people tended to stick closer to their native soil. They didn't venture very far off from where they lived. A stranger or a foreigner would be somebody, living as close as 50 miles away. So they became very self-sufficient. They did not interact too frequently with people outside of the manor. Maybe occasionally they would trade with a merchant or something like that. But by and large, the system became very self-sufficient. The lord lived in the manor house or castle, and provided military force to protect the peasants in wartime. And given all the things that were going on, Viking invasions and things of that nature, periodically it was necessary to have a protector of sorts. So, when under attack, peasants were sometimes allowed inside the castle or fortification so that they could be protected by the professional military people, the knights. During the Middle Ages, there were agricultural developments which made this lifestyle possible. With these small segments of land, there had to be some improvements in agricultural knowledge in order to have enough food to feed the population there without doing a significant amount of trade. Among these innovations were included the heavy plow, which utilized iron and cut a deep furrow into the ground as opposed to the wooden plow. Um, this would enable the soil to be tilled more deeply and more thoroughly, making the crops more productive. Also, more effective horse harnesses were created for the plow, allowing them to put more land under cultivation. Water mills became more common for milling grains. Basically, they would create a water wheel along some type of stream or water source, and they would have these big millstones within them. And the grain would be placed between the millstones, which were specially carved, and they would crush the grains into flour or meal or whatever they were seeking out of that particular grain. And the water mills would be used, in fact, well into the 20th century. An early form of crop rotation was also used, which made the land more productive. When you plant crops, each particular crop extracts certain types of nutrients from the soil, and if you continue to plant the same crop there year after year, your crop will become less and less productive. So they figured out in the Middle Ages that if you rotated your crop, planted different crops in each spot each year, you would have a better crop yield. And a strict social hierarchy evolved in the manor system, from lowest to highest, including the following classes. That would be serfs, peasants, knights, nobles, and kings. And in this diagram, I have on the very top the Pope because Europe-wide, the Pope was the only recognized authority on any particular thing. Not that everybody, did everything the Pope wanted, but the Pope had a significant amount of power, as most of these territories were under the Church. Each of the classes relied on the others while providing certain goods and services to them. So there was this thing called reciprocity. I will do this for you and you will do this for me. Okay. At the very bottom of the hierarchy were the serfs and the peasants. The peasants rented small plots of land and or practiced a trade, something like being a blacksmith or baking bread. And they were free to leave. They were not required to stay there. The serfs, however, had to stay there. They could not leave the territory. They were not slaves. They couldn't be sold apart from the land, but they could not leave the land. The serfs would rent a small parcel of land from the lord, and they would pay for it with shares from their crop and with their labor. And on certain days, they would be allowed to farm their own plots to grow food for their families. Serfs, once again, were not chattel. In other words, they were not slaves. They could not be sold apart from the land. However, if the land was sold, they were part of the exchange because they could not leave. So they were permanently placed in this situation. A person could become a serf out of necessity by binding him or herself to the land, or you could be born into serfdom, depending on your situation. Serfs could possibly buy their freedom or become nobles through acts of valor in wartime, although this was not terribly common. And the conditions of serfdom would vary between different kingdoms in different parts of Europe. Serfdom would largely disappear from Western Europe in the 14 and 1500s. The Black Plague basically would make labor very scarce and make it very difficult to keep the serfs and peasants on the land because other opportunities were available. So they would begin, the lords would begin using money for paid labor instead of a share of the crops. And the monarchs wisely became more powerful by beginning to ally themselves with the lower classes. And they would use the lower classes against the nobility, and there would be certain military and economic changes we'll discuss later on that would enable them to do that. Eastern Europe, however, especially Russia, serfdom would remain the same until about the middle of the 19th century. Serfs were chattel, eventually made chattel, which meant they could be sold apart from their land. And their names were recorded by the government, and they had their families permanently considered serfs. Okay, so if your name was in this book somewhere in Moscow, you and all of your descendants were serfs. Okay, knights. Knights were professional soldiers serving the lord. Okay, a lord, rather. Beg your pardon. They sometimes became vassals to a lord by receiving land from him, and in exchange they would provide military service when asked. The knights were a class of lower nobility. You had to be from the nobility to become a knight. Also, the knights were fought as cavalry on horses, and that's how most of the fighting was done during the Middle Ages. And to afford a horse, you pretty much had to be from the noble class. Okay. To train as a knight, even to train or enter knighthood, you had to come from a noble family. What would happen is, at the age of 15, a boy would become a squire, which is basically a knight in training, and he would do things like take care of the knight's armor, look after his horse, basically run around and kind of learn the trade as he performed these duties. Squires had to master what were known as the 7 points of agilities. These were physical tasks they had to be competent in order to be granted knighthood. And they included riding, swimming and diving, shooting weapons, things like bows and arrows, and later on firearms, climbing, wrestling, fencing, and long jumping. So you had to be physically fit in order to fill this role. And at age 21, they could be made into a knight. Knights were expected to follow something called the Code of Chivalry. The contents of this chivalric code vary. There's a lot of debate about what it consisted of, but generally speaking, it included things such as the following: loyalty, bravery, defending the church, generosity, championing good over evil. And but historians have shown that many of the knights did not follow the code. If you look at these folks there with their swords and pikes and daggers, the peasants and serfs were pretty much defenseless against them, and it's been shown that often they were thugs. They would go around and terrorize people, destroy property, extort money from peasants, and on and on. There were many different types of knighthood, and it would vary according to social class, and some were religious orders, and it would vary between kingdoms. Very different throughout different parts of Europe. There were hereditary and special orders of knights, such as the Templars, that were a religious order. Improved weapons and political changes, however, led to a decline in knighthood in the late Middle Ages. In particular, firearms, the longbow, and things like that. They made it became much easier and much more beneficial to have foot soldiers, what would become known as the infantry. And we'll talk about that later on. Cavalry lost its edge over the infantry, making knights less important, and the whole idea of knighthood kind of fell into decline. Nobility was a hereditary social class which was near the top of the feudal order. If you were a noble, you could possibly inherit the throne somehow, your particular kingdom. Nobles had various titles related to their power, and it had to do with the territories they controlled. Examples of some titles include lords and ladies, dukes and duchesses, earls and countesses, barons and baronesses. All very fascinating, and you can look some of these things up on Google and read about them. They are all pretty interesting how they came about. And there were many more, and it depends on the particular kingdom within which the noble order existed. Often the nobles were at odds with each other, vying for perhaps the throne, succession to the throne, or seeking new land or seeking new wealth. So it wasn't, this big happy family. Even though this was a tight unit, self-sufficient unit, there was, of course, conflict. Anytime you have human beings in some type of social hierarchy, you're going to have conflict. Later, they would become rivals with the monarchs themselves for power and control. Also, high-ranking church officials were part of the nobility. And this would include bishops and abbots who had their own little kingdoms and often led men into battle to protect those kingdoms. One of the reasons that some of the early Protestant revolts took place in the Holy Roman Empire can be traced to some of the kings and princes and dukes and so forth living in these small little territories, wanting to take over the lands that were held by these bishops and abbots. Monarchs were at the very top of the social order. And while they were initially elected, their title eventually became hereditary. Eventually, most began to claim the divine right of kings, believing they were God's representatives on earth. And initially, they were very dependent upon the nobility, but eventually they consolidated their power over the nobility with certain military and economic changes that were coming towards the late Middle Ages. Kings ruled through private courts. They had these small courts with their friends and relatives, certain nobles and clergy. They would have a court jester to provide comic relief, break things up a little bit if things were getting too intense. The courts eventually evolved into legislative bodies, such as the French Parliament. The idea of a parliament or council or deliberative body kind of emerged from this. And some would eventually develop into cabinets and other legal bodies. Like other feudal roles, the role of king would change over the centuries. For a time, they consolidated their power. As the modern European state emerged and became more powerful, so initially did the kings. Eventually, however, they would lose their power to democratic movements who insisted on, you would have a growing middle class that would insist upon more power and representation, and that would diminish, over time the role and power of the king. And in European countries where there still are monarchies, their role is largely symbolic. So to summarize, the manor was a self-sufficient political system that characterized the Middle Ages. Each social class had its role and had a reciprocal relationship with the other class. You do this for me, I'll do this for you. Monarchs were at the top of the social hierarchy, but they would eventually consolidate their powers over the nobles. However, democratic movements would eventually reduce the role of the monarch, and where they still exist, they are largely symbolic. Thanks for your attendance. Hope to talk to you soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.